The Harvest Table. Chapter 1. The Color of May. The bluebonnets were showing off again. Hazel Morrow had lived on this particular stretch of hill country land for going on 19 years, and every single May, without fail, the meadow made her catch her breath like she was seeing it for the first time. A rolling carpet of violet blue, running all the way to the cedar fence line, broken up by bursts of Indian paintbrush so vivid and red they looked like something a child had pressed into the landscape with a thumb. The live oaks along the far edge were full and heavy with new growth. The limestone hills beyond them had gone soft gold in the late afternoon light, the way they only did in the hour before the sun dropped behind them. That hill country gold that painters chased and photographers never quite captured, and which Hazel had given up trying to describe to people who hadn't seen it themselves. She was standing on the second rung of a wooden ladder, threading the last strand of Edison bulbs through the cedar pergola above the harvest table, and she had approximately 93 minutes before 30. Dinner guests arrived on her property, expecting magic. She was not worried. This was her element, the way water was a fish's element. Not something she moved through so much as something she was made of. Sycamore Hill Inn and event venue had been her hands and her heart, and some years, her entire personality for nearly 2 decades. She had built it from a crumbling limestone farmhouse and a weedy pasture on the back end of a modest inheritance and an immodest amount of stubbornness. She had hauled stone and planted seed and learned to make a French butter sauce and a proper charcuterie board, and how to speak to a nervous bride in the 30 minutes before her ceremony in a way that actually helped. She had done most of it alone and on purpose, because 19 years ago she had emerged from a marriage that left her feeling like a lamp with no bulb, present, functional in shape, but giving off absolutely no light. And she had decided, quietly and permanently, that she would rather build something of her own than wait to be part of someone else's. What she'd built was this: 7 guest rooms inside the old farmhouse, each named for a Texas wildflower. A renovated stone barn for weddings and private events, a kitchen garden that Jess kept better than Hazel ever had. And out here, her favorite thing, the thing guests talked about for years, the outdoor harvest table. A single long table of rough-hewn cedar, seating 30, positioned in the meadow at the edge of the wildflowers, strung with lights and set with mismatched linen and mason jars of whatever was blooming that week. No phones at the table, no assigned seating, just people and food and the hill country settling into evening around them like a long, slow exhale. Tonight's menu was already plated and waiting in the barn kitchen. Spring greens with strawberries and a honey pepper vinaigrette, a hill country lamb ragout over fresh pasta, asparagus roasted with lemon, and a lavender honey panna cotta that Jess had made 4 of and deemed only 2 acceptable, which meant Hazel had eaten a lot of panna cotta this week. She looped the last bulb over its hook and climbed down the ladder, stepping back to assess. The light was just right. The table looked beautiful. The meadow smelled like rain from 2 nights ago, and warm earth and the faintest sweet cedar smoke from somewhere to the north. "You're not going to move that centerpiece, are you?" Hazel turned. Luke Brennan was walking toward her from the fence line, moving the way he always moved, unhurried, like a man who had long since made his peace with the pace of things. He was tall, built broad through the shoulders, in a way that 19 years of army service and 3 years of farming had apparently agreed on, and he was holding a pair of long-handled pruning shears he had borrowed from her sometime in March, and clearly never returned. "I wasn't going to," she said, "but now that you mention it." "Leave the centerpiece alone." He stopped at the edge of the pergola and looked up at the lights, then out at the meadow. "That's something, Hazel." "Bluebonnets did the heavy lifting." "They did?" He handed her the pruning shears. "Found these in my equipment shed. Figured you might need them before I needed to replace them." "I was going to remind you about those." "Sure you were?" She laughed, short and genuine, and set the shears against the ladder. Luke leaned against the fence post at the meadow's edge, looking out at the view, with his arms crossed and a comfortable quiet around him that she had always appreciated. Some people needed to fill silence. Luke Brennan treated it like good company. "First farm dinner of the season?" he asked. "First big one. I did a smaller dinner for 12 in April, but tonight's the real opener." She glanced toward the barn, calculating. "Lambs rested. Jess has the table set inside in case the wind picks up. I think we're good." "You're always good." She cut him a look. "Don't jinx it." He smiled and pushed off the post. "Want help moving anything before I head back?" The offer was genuine. It always was, and she felt the small familiar pull of wanting to say yes. Not because she needed the help, because he was easy company, and the evening was beautiful, and some part of her she didn't examine too carefully, would have liked to keep him in it a little longer. "I've got it," she said. "Go check your trees." He nodded, no argument, and turned back toward the orchard. His peach trees were visible just beyond the fence line, long, orderly rows of them, the fruit still small and green in the Maylight, but coming along. He'd told her 2 weeks ago that if the weather held, it would be a good harvest. She hoped it would be. She watched him go for just a moment. Then she picked up her pruning shears and went to make magic for 30 strangers. The evening was everything she'd hoped for. The guests arrived in the long, hill country dusk, drawn down the gravel drive by the glow of lights through the meadow. There were 3 couples celebrating anniversaries, a group of women from Austin on a long weekend getaway, a pair of sisters visiting from Georgia who had never been to Texas and kept using the word majestic in a way that would have been funny if it hadn't also been completely accurate. Jess circulated with sparkling water and a warm smile, seating people with the gentle authority of someone who'd been doing this for 6 years and had never once made it feel like management. The conversation rose and fell around the long cedar table. Someone made a toast. One of the anniversary couples held hands through the main course. The Georgia sisters declared the panna cotta the best thing they'd ever eaten in their lives. And Hazel made a mental note to tell Jess, who would act modest and be secretly thrilled. The hill country did what it always did at night, deepened. The limestone hills went from gold to violet to a blue so dark it was almost black, and the stars came out the way they only do far from city light, thick and close, the Milky Way cutting a pale swath through the center of the sky. Fireflies started up in the meadow. Someone at the far end of the table said softly, "Oh my goodness," and it didn't need any response. This, Hazel thought, carrying empty plates back toward the barn. This is the thing, not the business, not the bookings, not the reviews on the travel websites. This moment, right here, people gathered around a table in the middle of something beautiful, surprised by grace. She still believed in grace. Sometimes, lately, it was the main thing she held on to. The guests left just after 9, trailing thank yous down the gravel drive. Jess stayed to help with the last of the cleanup, then hugged Hazel goodbye and reminded her to drink some water and not stay up too late, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. It was such a pointed instruction that Hazel had to assume it was based on prior evidence. Alone, she walked back out to the harvest table. The lights were still on. The meadow was silver and dark around it, and the night air had cooled to that perfect hill country temperature, the one that made the day's heat feel like a different season entirely. She sat down at the end of the long cedar table and rested her hands flat against the grain of it, and felt the quiet settle around her, like something she'd earned. Her phone buzzed on the table. Dean. The word sat there on the screen, and something in Hazel's chest went still. Her brother didn't call at 9:30 on a Thursday for no reason. She picked it up. "Hey, Dean." "Hazel?" His voice was controlled in the way it got when he was managing something. She knew that voice. "I need to tell you something about Mom." She was already standing, though she hadn't decided to. What happened? "She went to the grocery store this morning, in Kerrville." A pause. "They found her sitting in the parking lot, Hazel. She couldn't remember how to get home. She couldn't remember where she'd parked. She just sat down." Another pause, shorter. "The store manager called me. My number was on a card in her wallet." Hazel stared at the light strung over the empty harvest table, at the wildflower meadow dark beyond it, at the stars indifferent and brilliant overhead. "Is she all right?" "She's home. She's fine now. But Hazel?" His voice shifted, not softer but more serious, which with Dean meant the same thing. "We need to talk about Mom, the three of us. This isn't something we can keep waiting on." She closed her eyes. "I know," she said. And she did know. She had known for months, in the way you know something you've been choosing not to look at directly, catching it in your peripheral vision, in the small, wrong moments, in the way her mother sometimes went quiet mid-sentence and looked at Hazel with an expression that was almost searching, as if her daughter's face were a word she was trying to remember. She had known. She just hadn't been ready for the knowing to become a conversation. "I'll call Patrice tonight," Dean said. "We'll set something up." "Okay," Hazel said. She stood there a long time after they hung up, her hand still around the phone, the hill country night around her vast and quiet and indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted, quietly, irrevocably, in the middle of what had otherwise been a perfectly beautiful evening. Above her, the Edison bulb swayed in a small, warm wind off the meadow. She reached over and turned them off. Chapter 2. What the doctor said? The drive from Fredericksburg to San Antonio took just under 2 hours on a good day, and Hazel made it on autopilot, south on 87 through the cedar-thick hills, picking up I-10 at the junction and following it down through the scrubby plateau country, where the elevation dropped and the landscape flattened, and the hill country slowly, reluctantly, gave way to city sprawl. She'd made this drive 100 times. Today, it felt like driving toward something she couldn't see clearly, but could already feel the shape of. She'd called Patrice the night before, after Dean had called her. Patrice had cried for about 4 minutes and then gotten very busy making logistical plans, which was how Patrice handled fear. Hazel had stayed on the phone with her for 45 minutes and then sat on her porch until midnight, listening to the coyotes out past the orchard and thinking about nothing in particular with great concentration. She hadn't slept well. The neurologist's office was in a quiet medical complex off the medical center loop. Beige walls, soft lighting, a waiting area designed to feel as unthreatening as possible, which mostly made it feel like grief in a cardigan. Dean was already there when Hazel arrived, standing near the reception desk in the jacket he wore when he wanted to project competence, which was most days. He was 55 and looked like their father around the jaw and eyes, though he would not have been pleased to hear it. He hugged Hazel and said she looked tired. "Thank you, Dean." Patrice arrived 7 minutes later with their mother. She had driven down from Dallas the day before and spent the night in Kerrville so she could bring Eleanor to the appointment herself. A quiet act of care that Hazel noted and appreciated more than she said. Eleanor Morrow walked through the door with her white hair pinned up and a pale blue linen blouse Hazel recognized from 3 Easters ago, and she looked, in the way she so often looked, absolutely fine. Better than fine. She looked lovely. She spotted Hazel, and her face opened into a smile that still did what it had always done, which was make Hazel feel 12 years old in the best possible way. "There she is," Eleanor said, and patted Hazel's cheek with a cool, soft hand. "Hardest working woman in Gillespie County." "Hi, Mama." "I keep telling these two." Eleanor gestured vaguely at Dean and Patrice. "There is nothing wrong with me that a good night's sleep wouldn't fix, but nobody listens to the patient." "We listen to you, Mom," Dean said. "You hear me?" Eleanor said pleasantly. "That's different." She wasn't wrong. Dr. Anita Rourke was thorough and kind and did not soften things more than was useful. She had already reviewed the cognitive assessment completed 2 weeks prior and the results of Eleanor's imaging, and she spoke with the steady gentleness of someone who had delivered this kind of news enough times to know that there was no angle from which it did not hurt. Early-stage Alzheimer's type dementia. Manageable now. The structure and the memories most deeply laid down, decades old, long loved, would be the last to go. But it would progress. That was the nature of it. Not if, only when and how fast, and those were questions that couldn't be answered yet. Eleanor sat very straight through the appointment and asked intelligent questions and thanked Dr. Rourke by name when they left. She was gracious and cooperative, and sharp in the way that made Hazel's chest ache with a deep and terrible tenderness, because the very quality of her mother in this moment, this dignified and warm and present woman, made the diagnosis feel more devastating, not less. This was not a woman who was already gone. This was her mother, fully here, in a room where someone had just told them all that the clock was running. In the hallway outside the office, Hazel pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly through her nose and told herself she would fall apart later, at home, when she was alone. Dean was already talking. He had a list. Of course he had a list. 3 memory care facilities in San Antonio that he'd researched online, with ratings and monthly costs and distance from Patrice's house in Alamo Heights. He was not wrong to have done the research. Dean was never wrong to be prepared. It was simply that watching him present his findings in the hallway outside the neurologist's office made Hazel feel like she was standing slightly outside her own body, watching a meeting she hadn't agreed to attend. Patrice had her arms crossed tight over her chest and her eyes bright with tears she was working very hard to contain. She looked at Dean, and she looked at her phone, and she looked at Hazel with an expression that said, without any words at all, "You're the one who lives there. You're the one who can do this." Nobody said it. Nobody needed to. The arithmetic of their lives was so plain. Dean in Houston with his company and his grandchild on the way. Patrice in Dallas with her husband's demanding travel schedule and her 2 teenagers still at home. And Hazel in Fredericksburg, 45 minutes from their mother's house in Kerrville, self-employed, unmarried, and therefore, in the quiet calculus of family assumption, available. She was not available. She was also not going to say so right now. "Let me take her home with me," Hazel said instead, "for a few days." Her mother, who had been reading a framed print on the hallway wall with apparent interest, turned around. "To Sycamore Hill." "To Sycamore Hill." Eleanor considered this for approximately 1 second. "The hill country always did suit me better than the city," she said. "Let me get my bag." They took the scenic route home because Eleanor asked to, and because Hazel wasn't ready for the drive to end. Her mother dozed somewhere past comfort, lulled by the motion and the long afternoon, and Hazel drove through the cedar hills with the windows down and the warm air moving through the car and tried to think clearly. The live oaks threw long shadows across the road. The hills rolled away in every direction, pale limestone and deep green cedar, indifferent and ancient and oddly comforting, the way things that have outlasted everything tend to be. There were no conclusions, just the road and her mother asleep in the passenger seat, and the hill country going gold around them. That night, after Eleanor was settled in the bluebonnet room with her familiar quilt and her small framed photograph and a glass of water on the nightstand, Hazel sat on the porch with her Bible in her lap and let the quiet have her for a while. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was just turning pages the way she did when she needed something to hold. The weight of the book, the thin, familiar paper under her thumb. She ended up in Isaiah, in the 46th chapter, and she read it slowly, the way she'd learned to read when she needed it to mean something. The passage spoke of God's steadfast promise to His people, that even as they grew old, even when their hair turned gray, He would still be carrying them. He had made them. He would sustain them. He would carry them and rescue them. That was the promise, plain and direct and ancient, even into old age. Even then. Hazel read it again, and then a third time. She took a pen from her pocket and wrote the reference in the margin, Isaiah 46:4, and then sat there in the dark, with the cicadas loud in the live oaks, and the hill country night pressing soft and vast against the edges of the porch light. And she held those words the way you hold something small and solid when everything else is uncertain. He would carry them. She wanted to believe that. She did believe it. She was simply also 36 hours into understanding that belief and fear were not opposites, and that trusting God with something didn't mean the something stopped being heavy. It just meant you weren't carrying it alone. At least, that was what it was supposed to mean. She was still working on the feeling of it. Chapter 3. Fence Lines and Fissures. The new rhythm announced itself on Monday morning at 5:47, when Hazel woke to the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing in the kitchen below. She lay still for a moment, listening. Open. Close. Open, close. Then silence. Then the sound of water running. She was downstairs in 2 minutes. Eleanor was standing at the kitchen counter in her robe and her good pearl earrings, both hands flat on the countertop, looking at the coffee maker with an expression of polite but genuine confusion. She glanced up when Hazel came in, and the confusion smoothed itself away. "I was going to make the coffee," Eleanor said, "but your machine is different from mine." "It's a little fussy," Hazel said, moving beside her. "I'll show you." She walked her mother through it, the water reservoir, the grounds, the button. And Eleanor watched and nodded and said it wasn't so different after all. They sat together at the kitchen table while it brewed. And Eleanor talked about the mockingbird she'd heard outside her window before dawn, doing impressions of every other bird on the property, and Hazel drank her coffee and laughed in the right places and felt the exhaustion of someone who had been asleep for 4 hours, pretending to be a person who had slept for 8. It had been like this for 6 days. Eleanor was good during the day, mostly. She helped Hazel deadhead the kitchen garden and folded linens with the brisk precision of a woman who had kept a very orderly house for 50 years. She chatted with Jess and remembered her name consistently, which Jess accepted as a compliment of the highest order. She sat on the porch in the afternoons with a novel and a glass of sweet tea and looked for all the world like a woman on a pleasant, extended visit. But the nights were harder. She didn't always sleep through, and when she woke, she was sometimes briefly, quietly lost, not frightened, just adrift, and Hazel had learned to listen for her with one ear always open, which meant Hazel wasn't sleeping so much as hovering just below the surface of it, ready to rise. By Thursday, she was running on coffee and momentum and the specific adrenaline of a woman who has too much to do to acknowledge that she is tired. Jess noticed. Of course Jess noticed. "You've refilled that coffee cup 4 times since 9 o'clock, Jess said Thursday morning, appearing in the doorway of the small office off the barn where Hazel was reviewing vendor invoices. "It's 11:15? I like coffee." "You're also answering emails with 2 typos per sentence, which is not like you." Jess leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed and her expression kind and immovable. She was 28 and cheerful and quietly impossible to deflect, which made her an excellent assistant and occasionally a nuisance. "How are you actually doing?" "I'm fine." "Okay." Jess didn't move. "Jess, I'm just standing here." Hazel set down her pen. "There's a lot going on. I'm managing it." "I know you're managing it," Jess said. "You always manage it. I'm asking how you are, which is different." Eleanor's voice drifted in from the porch, something about the mockingbird again. "I'll sleep better when I have a better plan in place," Hazel said, which was true enough to pass for an answer. "I appreciate you asking." Jess held her gaze for one more moment, then nodded and let it go. But she refilled Hazel's water glass before she left and set it on the desk without comment, and Hazel understood that this was its own kind of care. Friday morning arrived cool and bright, with a clean wind coming down off the hills that smelled like cedar and recent rain. Hazel and Eleanor were in the kitchen garden when she heard the familiar sound of boots on gravel and looked up to find Luke Brennan at the fence line, holding a small wooden basket. "Early peaches," he announced. "Not quite there yet, but promising." Hazel straightened up. Beside her, Eleanor straightened up too and shaded her eyes with one hand and looked at Luke with the frank and unapologetic assessment of a woman who had raised 3 children and outlasted considerable nonsense. "Well," Eleanor said, "Mama, this is my neighbor Luke Brennan. He runs the peach orchard next door. Luke, this is my mother, Hazel Morrow." Luke came through the gate and extended his hand, and Eleanor took it with a smile that Hazel recognized as the one her mother deployed for people she had decided immediately to like. "A peach farmer," Eleanor said. "How wonderful. Are you married, Luke?" "Mama." "I'm not, ma'am," Luke said without a trace of discomfort. Eleanor turned and looked at Hazel with an expression of such clear and deliberate meaning that Hazel felt heat rise directly to her face. It was remarkable, she thought, how her mother could do that, cut straight through to a thing with perfect clarity at the exact moment you'd prefer she didn't. "Well?" Eleanor said again, and accepted the basket of peaches from Luke as if the matter were settled. Luke stayed for a few minutes. He showed Eleanor how to tell when a peach was close, the way the green faded near the stem, the faint blush beginning to show beneath the skin. And Eleanor listened with genuine interest and asked 2 sharp questions about the orchard's water supply that Luke answered with evident respect. He was good with her, natural and easy, not performative about it, not careful in the way people got when they didn't quite know how to be. He was simply himself, which was apparently sufficient to charm Hazel Morrow thoroughly inside of 10 minutes. Eventually, Eleanor announced she was going inside to put the peaches in a bowl because they deserved to be looked at, and she took the basket and made her way up to the porch and left the 2 of them standing in the kitchen garden with the morning sun warm on their shoulders. Luke looked at Hazel. "How are you doing?" he asked. Just that. Quiet and direct, without preamble. "I'm fine," Hazel said. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man who was choosing to accept an answer he wasn't entirely convinced by. He didn't push. He never pushed. He just picked up the empty basket and said he'd let her get back to it, and turned toward the gate. She watched him cross back to the orchard, moving between the long rows of peach trees with that easy, familiar stride. Just before he reached the far end of the first row, he looked back. She saw him look back. She picked up her trowel and made herself very busy with the tomato steaks. The email from Dean arrived at 6:48 that evening with the subject line, Memory care. Information for discussion. It was organized into 3 sections with bullet points because Dean organized everything into sections with bullet points. It included the names and websites of 3 facilities in San Antonio, each with a rating, a monthly cost range, and a note on distance from Patrice's house in Alamo Heights. There was a final bullet point at the bottom that said, "Suggest we plan a visit within the next 30 days, before waitlists become an issue." Hazel read it once, then she read it again. Then a third time, slower. She didn't reply. She set her phone face down on the kitchen counter and went to check on her mother. Eleanor was asleep by 9:30, which was a gift. Hazel stood in the doorway of the bluebonnet room and listened to the even, peaceful rhythm of her breathing and let herself look, really look, without having to arrange her face into anything. Her mother's face in sleep was smooth and quiet, younger somehow, or not younger, exactly, but unguarded in a way that daytime didn't allow. The framed photograph was on the nightstand, where it always was, wherever her mother traveled. A black and white image from 1971 of a young couple standing in a field. The woman in a simple dress with flowers in her hair, the man with his hand at the small of her back and his face turned toward hers, like she was the most interesting thing in any landscape. The field in the photograph was full of wildflowers. It looked in the way of things that are probably coincidence, but feel like something more, not entirely different from the meadow outside. Hazel stood in the doorway for a long time. Chapter 4. Sunday Houses and Slow Mornings. She woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee. Hazel lay still for a moment, parsing this information. The coffee smell meant her mother had been up first. The birdsong meant it was early. The absence of any cabinet door percussion meant Eleanor had remembered how to use the machine. She was downstairs in 4 minutes anyway, because she was who she was. Her mother was seated at the kitchen table with a full cup, the back door open to the morning, watching a white-winged dove pick its way across the garden path with great self-importance. She looked up when Hazel came in, and her eyes were clear and warm and entirely present, and Hazel felt something in her chest release like a held breath. It was going to be a good day. You learned to know it early. "I made enough for 2, Eleanor said. "Sit down. You worked too hard before breakfast." Hazel sat down. She accepted the coffee her mother poured without argument. Outside, the dove found something worth eating and settled into it with evident satisfaction. "Let's go into town today," Hazel said. Eleanor looked up with the expression of someone who had just been offered exactly what they wanted but intended to be gracious about it. "I suppose we could do that," she said. Fredericksburg on a late spring Saturday morning was a quietly lovely thing. The air still cool from the night before, the limestone storefronts on Main Street catching the early light, window boxes spilling over with petunias in pink and white, and a yellow so bright it was almost impolite. The pecan trees along the sidewalk were full and green. The town had a permanence about it, the settled quality of a place that had been exactly itself for a very long time, and saw no reason to change on anyone's account, which Hazel had always found quietly reassuring. They parked near the Marktplatz, the town square anchored by the old Vereinskirche, the 8-sided building the German settlers had built in 1847, reconstructed now as a museum, its distinctive shape as much a part of the Fredericksburg skyline as the limestone courthouse up the hill. Eleanor knew the history as well as Hazel did, had known it for decades, but she looked at the old building with fresh appreciation as they walked past. "The Germans knew how to build something that would last," she said. "They did," Hazel agreed. They made their way down Main Street at Eleanor's pace, which was easy and observant and occasionally diverted by something in a shop window. They stopped at a small bakery 2 blocks from the square, where a woman Hazel knew slightly from church slid a tray of kolaches onto the counter with the reverence they deserved. Soft, pillowy dough wrapped around cream cheese and fruit filling. The kind of thing that had been made in this town in some form since the first German families arrived in the 1840s and found they needed a piece of home in the middle of all that wild and unfamiliar land. Eleanor ate hers slowly and said it was the best thing she'd had all week. Hazel didn't mention the panna cotta. They were walking back toward the Marktplatz when Eleanor stopped at a narrow gap between 2 storefronts and looked down the alley at a small, spare structure, barely larger than a single room. Simple board and batten siding, a modest porch, windows that looked onto the alley with the patient expression of a building that had seen considerable history and was not impressed by any of it. "Is that a Sunday house?" Eleanor asked. "It is." Hazel stopped beside her. One of the last ones still on this side of town. There were perhaps a dozen of the original Sunday houses remaining in Fredericksburg, scattered among the newer construction like quiet punctuation marks. German settlers in the hill country had built them beginning in the 1860s. Small, plain weekend structures in town where farm families could stay Saturday night after driving their wagons in from the outlying land so they could attend church on Sunday morning without attempting the long, rough roads home in the dark. A house just for Sundays, a place to rest between the long week and the holy day. A house just for Sundays, Eleanor said, which was exactly what she'd said, Hazel reflected, the last several times they'd stood in front of one, but she said it the way you say something that still strikes you as beautiful. Not by rote, but as though the idea had just arrived fresh. "That's something," Eleanor added. "Those people worked so hard all week, and then they built themselves a little place just to rest and worship." She paused, looking at the small building. "I think there's a sermon in that somewhere." Hazel laughed. "Probably several." They found a bench in the Marktplatz and sat in the shade of a pecan tree and watched the Saturday morning foot traffic move along Main Street. Tourists with coffee cups and cameras, locals running Saturday errands, a group of children chasing each other around the base of the Vereinskirche replica with the single-minded urgency of children who have been in a car for too long. Eleanor bought a small bunch of dried lavender from a vendor near the square and held it in her lap and talked about Hazel's father. She told a story Hazel hadn't heard in years, about the summer they'd driven through the hill country before they were married, before any of the children, before any of the years of ordinary life that came after. And her father had pulled off the road near Enchanted Rock because Eleanor had never seen a Texas sunset from high ground, and he'd said she had to. They'd climbed up the smooth pink granite in the long evening light and sat on the dome of that ancient stone and watched the sky go every color it knew, and her father had said, "Eleanor, I think I could look at beautiful things with you for the rest of my life." "And then I married him," Eleanor said, which I suppose was my answer. Hazel was quiet for a moment. "That's a good story, Mama." "He was a good man." Simple, certain, the way she said the truest things. They were on the way back to the car, walking slowly in the good late-morning warmth, when Eleanor stopped mid-sentence. She had been telling Hazel something, about the lavender or the bakery or something her neighbor in Kerrville had said recently, and then the thread simply wasn't there anymore. She stopped walking. She stopped talking. She looked at Hazel with an expression that was worse than confusion, because it wasn't confusion. It was awareness of confusion, which was its own particular cruelty. "I was saying something," Eleanor said. The words came out careful and quiet. "Wasn't I?" "You were," Hazel said, her voice even and warm. She took her mother's arm. "About Mrs. Peterson next door, I think." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the steadiness of it, the not making it a moment. Eleanor nodded slowly. The awareness flickered and receded. "Mrs. Peterson," she repeated, and let Hazel steer her gently forward. They walked the rest of the way to the car, with Eleanor's hand tucked in the crook of Hazel's arm, and neither of them said anything about what had just happened, because some things are better carried quietly than spoken about in a parking lot on a Saturday morning. They were almost to the car when a familiar voice said, "Well, small town does it again." Luke was crossing the parking lot behind the hardware store, a paper bag under one arm and the relaxed, easy look of a man running Saturday errands with no particular urgency. He spotted them and changed direction without hesitation. He fell into step beside them with the natural ease of someone who understood that company was being offered, not imposed. He walked with them back to the bench at the edge of the lot. Eleanor wanted to sit again, just for a moment, and talked about the town, the history, the German families who'd carved this community out of the limestone hills with extraordinary stubbornness and faith, and a firm belief that good food was non-negotiable, regardless of circumstance. He talked about the peach orchards, how they'd come generations after the first settlers, how the hill country soil and the cold winters and the warm springs had turned out to be nearly perfect for them, how the harvest ran from May through August, depending on the variety, and felt every year like something quietly miraculous. Eleanor asked about his trees by name, as though they were mutual acquaintances. Hazel sat beside her mother and watched Luke talk, attentive, genuinely interested in Eleanor's questions, and felt something loosen behind her ribs that she didn't have words for yet. Something that settled rather than stirred. Something warm and almost painfully quiet, like a room where the light is exactly right. She looked away before he could catch her looking. That night, after Eleanor was asleep and the house was still, Hazel sat at her writing desk with her journal and her Bible, and the dried lavender her mother had bought in the Marktplatz, which she'd set in a small glass on the corner of the desk because it smelled like something good. She opened her journal and wrote for a while, about the day, about the kolaches, about her mother's face when she told the story of Enchanted Rock and the sunset and her father's quiet, certain words. About the moment on the sidewalk when the thread had slipped, and the way Eleanor had looked at her, and how Hazel had held it steady by sheer will and love, and the refusal to let fear into her voice. Then she opened her Bible and found herself in the Psalms, the 31st chapter, near the middle. The psalmist's words, raw and trusting at once, spoke of choosing to trust in God, of placing one's times entirely in His hands. "My times are in your hands." She read it twice. Then she picked up her pen and wrote it in the margin of her journal, Psalm 31, 14-15, and beneath it she wrote her mother's name, and then, after a moment, her own. "My times. Her times in your hands." She looked at the lavender for a while. Outside, the hill country night was enormous and quiet and full of stars. She closed the journal. She thought before she slept about a man who looked back. Chapter 5. The Family Table. Dean and Patrice arrived on a Saturday, which Hazel appreciated because it meant she had something to do with her hands. She spent the morning cooking, a proper hill country meal, the kind her mother had always made for company. Beef brisket that had been in the oven since before dawn, a pot of pinto beans with smoked ham hock, skillet cornbread, a cucumber and tomato salad from the kitchen garden, the kind of meal that said, "You are welcome here," in a language older than words. She was aware that she was also, on some level, building a small fortress out of food, that if the table was beautiful and the meal was good, and the house was in order, then perhaps the conversation would be too. She knew better. She cooked anyway. Eleanor had woken up somewhere in the middle of herself that morning, not lost, not fully clear, but drifting in and out like a radio signal on a long hill drive. She was cheerful enough and dressed herself without help, and came downstairs with her hair pinned and her good earrings in. But she called Hazel by her sister's name twice before noon, and then looked briefly puzzled when Hazel corrected her, as though the correction were the strange part. Jess had offered to stay. Hazel had said no, then reconsidered, then said yes. Jess showed up at 11 with a pie she claimed she'd made for other reasons, and stayed through lunch without once making it feel like surveillance. Dean and Patrice arrived together just after 1, having driven from San Antonio where they'd met the night before. They came in with the careful cheerfulness of people bracing for something, which Eleanor either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge. She hugged them both and asked Dean about his grandchild-to-be and told Patrice that her hair looked better longer, which was Eleanor's version of a compliment. The afternoon passed with the uneasy texture of family gatherings held under unspoken weight, pleasant on the surface, careful underneath. They ate together at the big kitchen table, and the food was good, and Eleanor told 2 stories from their childhood that made Dean laugh genuinely, and Patrice cry a little, which she covered by getting up to refill the cornbread basket. But by 6 o'clock, Eleanor was fading, worn thin by the company and the effort of a long day. Hazel walked her upstairs and sat with her while she got ready for bed, and listened to her mother say, half asleep before her head touched the pillow, "It's good to have the children home." She meant it for all 3 of them. She also might have been somewhere else entirely. It didn't matter. Hazel turned off the light and went back downstairs. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table with their coffee cups and the remains of the pie. And for a moment, nobody said anything, because nobody wanted to be the one to begin. Dean began. He was measured and thorough and not unkind, and he laid out the case the way he laid out everything, clearly, logically, with the evidence organized and the conclusion stated plainly. The memory care facilities in San Antonio were good ones. Professional staff trained specifically for dementia care, structured environments that reduced confusion and improved quality of life, safe, supervised, near Patrice. And this, his voice was steady, not cruel, would get harder. It would not get easier. That was simply the nature of what they were dealing with, and the time to make a plan was before the crisis, not after it. He was not wrong. This was the thing Hazel kept running up against, the thing she couldn't argue with, no matter how much she wanted to. Dean was not wrong. Patrice said she just wanted what was best for Mama. She said it with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her eyes bright. And Hazel knew she meant it completely, and also that meaning it completely did not make it any easier to sit across from her sister right now. "I want what's best for her, too," Hazel said. She heard the edge in her own voice and tried to sand it down. Then let her stay where she knows the land and the light and the people. Let her stay near me. Hazel. Dean's voice was patient. "You run a business. You have events every weekend through October. You cannot run Sycamore Hill and provide proper dementia care at the same time. That's not a criticism. It's just true." It hit the way true things hit when you've been hoping someone wouldn't say them out loud. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen. Her kitchen, the one she had rebuilt from the original farmhouse stone, with the herbs drying above the window and the old iron hook by the door where her mother had been hanging her cardigan every morning for 2 weeks. "I know it's hard," Patrice said carefully. "I know you love her. We all love her. But could you at least consider it? The facility in Alamo Heights has a waiting list. If we don't at least get on it, I'll consider it," Hazel said. The words came out flat and final, and both of her siblings recognized them for what they were. Not a yes, not even a real maybe, but the end of the conversation for tonight. Dean nodded. Patrice looked at her hands. They finished their coffee and said their goodbyes, and drove back toward San Antonio in the dark, and Hazel stood in the open doorway and watched the taillights disappear down the gravel drive, and then stood there a while longer in the warm night air, not quite ready to go back inside. She sat on the porch steps. The peach orchard was faintly silver under a half moon, the trees standing in their long, quiet rows, the fruit invisible in the dark, but there, growing, slow and steady, indifferent to the schedules and arguments of the people on the other side of the fence. The cicadas were loud. The air smelled like warm cedar and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and then she stopped holding it. She cried the way you cry when you've been not crying for weeks. Not elegantly, not quietly, but the deep shaking kind that starts somewhere below the ribs and doesn't ask permission. She cried for her mother, asleep upstairs with her photograph on the nightstand and her pearl earrings on the dresser and the years already behind them and the ones still coming. She cried because Dean was right, and she hated it. She cried because she was tired in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. She cried because she had said, "I'll consider it," and hadn't meant it, and the dishonesty of it settled in her stomach like a stone. She didn't know that the kitchen light was on in the farmhouse across the fence line. She didn't know that Luke Brennan, washing up after a late supper, could see the glow of her porch light through the orchard. She didn't know that he stood at his kitchen window for a long moment, watching, and then dried his hands slowly on a dish towel and considered going over. And then didn't, because sometimes the most careful thing you can offer a person is the space to fall apart without an audience. He turned his kitchen light off at 10:15. Her porch light was still on. Sunday morning came anyway, the way Sunday mornings do. Hazel got herself and her mother dressed and drove them both to Cornerstone Community Church on the edge of town, a modest limestone building with a wooden cross over the door and a congregation that had been meeting in one form or another on this land for 3 generations. The parking lot held a mix of pickup trucks and sensible sedans, and one ancient station wagon that belonged to Connie Vasquez and had belonged to Connie Vasquez since approximately the second Bush administration. Pastor Garrett Howell was a mild-looking man in his early 60s who wore plain clothes and spoke without notes and had a quality that Hazel had spent years trying to name and finally settled on as presence. The sense that when he stood at the front of a room, the room itself became more attentive. He preached like a man who trusted the words to do the work if he just got out of their way. His sermon that morning was on a passage from Matthew, the invitation Jesus extended to all who were worn out and carrying too much. "Come to me," he said, "all of you who are exhausted and overburdened, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Hazel sat in the 4th pew from the front, her mother's hand warm in hers, and felt the words land somewhere, bruised and real, not on the surface of her, but down in the tired place, the place that had been awake at 5:47 every morning and carrying something too heavy to name out loud on a parking lot on a Saturday. "Come to me." She pressed her lips together and looked at the cross above the altar and breathed slowly. "I'm trying," she thought. It wasn't quite a prayer, and it wasn't quite not one. Beside her, Eleanor was nodding slightly, the way she did when she recognized something true. Chapter 6. Peaches and Plain Truth. She heard him at the fence on Tuesday morning. Hazel was in the kitchen garden with her coffee, doing the thing she did some mornings when the inn was quiet and her mother was still asleep. Just walking the rows slowly, checking on things, touching leaves, letting the garden be what it was without asking anything of it. She heard Luke's voice before she saw him, low and even, talking to someone on his phone. And then the call ended, and he was standing at the fence line, looking like a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Short-handed, she guessed. He looked up. 2 of my guys called out this week. Harvest stand open Saturday. He looked back at the orchard. I'll manage. I'll help Saturday, she said. Jess can stay with my mother. He started to say something that looked like you don't have to, and she gave him a look that closed that sentence before it opened, and he nodded instead, and that was that. Saturday arrived hot and clear and unambiguous about its intentions, the kind of early June day that reminded you summer in the Texas Hill Country was not a gentle season. By 8 o'clock, the sun was already well into its work, the air warm and dry and smelling of baked grass and the faint sweetness coming off the orchard in waves. The Brennan Peach Farm roadside stand was a cedar-roofed structure at the end of the gravel road where Luke's property met the highway. 2 long tables, a hanging scale, hand-lettered signs, and more peaches than Hazel had seen in one place in years. They were coming in heavy this season, Luke said. The late frost had held off just long enough. The spring rains had been exactly right. He said it with the careful, almost superstitious gratitude of a farmer who knew better than to expect good fortune twice. They worked easily together. Hazel weighed and wrapped while Luke restocked from the orchard crates, and the customers came in a steady, easy stream. Locals who knew Luke by name, tourists who had seen the sign from the highway and pulled over on impulse, a restaurant buyer from Austin who walked the table with professional attention and ordered 2 full cases. Hazel helped a young mother pick out a bag of the smaller, sweeter variety for her children and told her they were best eaten over the sink, which made the woman laugh and buy 2 bags instead of 1. The work had a rhythm to it that Hazel found unexpectedly calming. Something about the physicality of it, the weight of the fruit in her hands, the repetition, the simple, clear purpose, loosened something in her shoulders she hadn't realized she'd been holding. An older woman stopped mid-morning, a Cornerstone regular named Dottie who had known Luke for years, and asked him how long he'd been farming out here. Luke said going on 3 years now, since he'd retired from the Army. Dottie asked what had brought him to Fredericksburg specifically, of all the places a retired colonel might land. He was quiet for a beat, not evasive, just honest. He said his wife Carol had loved the hill country. They'd talked for years about retiring here, buying land, doing something slower and rooted than the life the Army gave you. Carol had died before they could do it, 8 years ago now, after 2 years of illness that had rearranged everything he thought he knew about time and what it was for. He said coming here anyway had felt less like starting over and more like keeping a promise. Dottie patted his arm and bought 3 pounds of the large freestones and drove away, and the stand was quiet for a moment. Hazel kept her eyes on the scale. I didn't know that part, she said, about Carol and the hill country. Not something that comes up easily. He set another crate on the table and opened it. But it's not something I mind saying. I'm sorry about Carol. Thank you. He said it simply, the way people say things they've said many times and made peace with. 8 years changes the shape of it. It doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it differently. A pause. You learn that carrying something hard doesn't make you a weak person. It just makes you a tired one. She looked at him then. He was looking at the peaches, turning one over in his hand with the focus of a man who was also saying something else entirely. Is that what I look like? She said. Tired. He met her eyes. You look like a woman carrying something that was never meant to be carried alone. She told him about the family meeting. Not all of it, and not in order, but enough. The kitchen table, Dean's bullet points, Patrice's careful, would you consider it? The way neither of them had looked directly at her when they talked about next steps, because the assumption was so plain it didn't require eye contact. She told him about standing in the doorway, watching their taillights go down the gravel drive, and feeling something she wasn't proud of. Not resentment exactly, but its first cousin. The feeling that her life was being arranged around her rather than by her, and that the arrangement was being offered as love. "And then I feel terrible for thinking it," she said, "because she's my mother, and I love her without reservation, and some nights Some nights, you're still just a person," Luke said, "not a daughter or a business owner or the one who lives nearby, just a person who's tired and scared and doing her best." He handed a bag to a passing customer without breaking the conversation. "That's allowed, Hazel." She looked away, out toward the highway, and blinked twice. "I'll pray for you," he said. "For your mother, for all of it." She believed him. That was the thing. She knew, without question, that he meant it, that it wasn't the thing people say, when they don't know what else to say, but an actual intention, a real offer. She had known him long enough to know the difference. "Thank you," she said. They reached for the same crate at the same moment, both of them going for the handle at the near end, their hands arriving at the same time. Neither of them moved away immediately. The contact was brief and slight, and utterly unremarkable by any observable measure. She felt it for the rest of the morning. Connie Vasquez arrived at 11:30, driving her ancient station wagon, which she parked at an angle that suggested the parking situation was beneath her consideration. She was 63 and broad-shouldered and had the manner of a woman who had spent 30 years as a nurse and had therefore seen everything and been impressed by very little. She wore her silver hair short and her opinions long and was one of the most genuinely loving people Hazel had ever known, which was what made her so impossible to deflect. She bought 4 pounds of peaches without looking at them, because the peaches were not really why she'd come. "How's Eleanor?" she asked Hazel. "She's having a pretty good week." "And how are you having?" "I'm managing fine, Connie." Connie looked at her for a moment with the expression of a retired nurse evaluating a patient who has just said, "I'm fine," a look that was neither cruel nor soft, but simply and completely unconvinced. "Hazel Morrow," she said, "you can love your mama with everything you've got and still ask for help. Those are not opposites." She picked up her peaches. "You know where I live. You know my number. I've got time and I've got skills, and I've been waiting for you to use them." She patted Hazel's hand once, firmly, the way you pat a table to make a point. "Don't make me wait too much longer, honey." She walked back to her car with her peaches and drove away at the same angle she'd arrived. Luke watched her go. "Has she always been like that?" "Since the day I met her," Hazel said. "It's terrifying and wonderful." He laughed, a real one, low and full, and Hazel discovered that she had been wanting to hear that laugh all morning without knowing it. Chapter 7. The night it all came apart. The rehearsal dinner was for a couple named Claire and Ben. Her family from Houston, his from Kerrville, 40 guests total, a June evening that had cooperated fully with the forecast and arrived warm and clear and draped in the golden light that made everything at Sycamore Hill look like a painting someone had been working on for years. Hazel had checked on Eleanor 3 times before the first guests arrived. Her mother was settled in the sitting room off the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea and the television on low, a nature program about the Serengeti that she watched with the same appreciative attention she gave to most things. Jess had checked on her twice after that. Eleanor had waved her off the second time with good-natured impatience and told her to go tend to the guests. So they had. The rehearsal dinner moved the way good events moved, with the illusion of effortlessness that was actually the product of considerable effort made invisible. The long tables under the pergola were full and loud, with the warm noise of 2 families becoming one. Claire's mother cried during the first toast, which Hazel had predicted to Jess at 4 o'clock and won a hypothetical dollar on. Ben's father told a story about his son that made everyone laugh and then go quiet in the way you go quiet when something true has just been said in a room. Hazel was carrying a tray of dessert plates from the barn kitchen when she heard Jess call her name. Not loudly, not in a way that alarmed the guests, but in the certain register that Hazel had learned over 6 years of working together meant, now, please, and don't run. She set the tray on the nearest flat surface and went. Eleanor was at the far edge of the wildflower meadow. She was standing in the dark, beyond the reach of the string lights, in her robe and her slippers, her white hair loose around her shoulders. She was calling a name, not Hazel's, not Patrice's, not Dean's. She was calling for her husband, dead 11 years, in the voice of a woman who fully expected him to answer. Robert, I can't find the... Robert, where did you... One of the guests, a young man from Ben's side of the family, had already reached her and was standing nearby at a careful distance, not touching, not sure what to do, his face arranged into the expression of someone trying hard to be helpful without making anything worse. He looked at Hazel with undisguised relief when she appeared. Hazel walked to her mother without hurrying. She came around to face her in the dark and said her name quietly and took both of her hands. Eleanor looked at her. The searching expression shifted, not immediately, but in stages, like light changing, and something in her face came partway back. I was looking for... She stopped, looked around at the meadow, looked at her own robe, her slippers, the damp grass under her feet. Something moved across her face that was worse than confusion. I went outside, she said. You did, Hazel said. It's all right. Let's go back in. She walked her mother across the meadow and in through the back door and upstairs to the bluebonnet room, and she sat with her until Eleanor's breathing evened and her eyes grew heavy, and the fear, because that was what it had been, that expression, pure and simple fear, faded back into sleep. Jess had handled the guests. Of course Jess had handled the guests. By the time Hazel came back down, the dessert plates had been delivered, and the moment had been absorbed into the evening with the minimum possible disruption. Claire and Ben said it was completely fine, not to worry, they hoped her mother was all right. They were kind about it, everyone was kind about it, it wasn't fine, not the way they meant. Hazel smiled and thanked them and meant the gratitude, and knew that something had shifted tonight that couldn't shift back. She saw the last guests out. She helped Jess with the first round of clearing and then told her to go home. She'd finish up, thank you, go. Jess went, reluctantly, with a long look back from the driveway. And then Hazel was alone in the house with the sound of the refrigerator and the last of the string lights still glowing through the window and the knowledge sitting solid and immovable in the center of her chest that she could not do this anymore. Not the way she'd been doing it. She made it to the laundry room. She wasn't sure why the laundry room specifically, only that it was at the back of the house, farthest from her mother's room, and she could close the door, and there was no window, and no one would see. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor between the washer and the folded stack of clean dish towels, and she came apart completely and without dignity, the way you can only do when you are absolutely certain no one is watching. She cried until there was nothing left that wanted to come out. Then she sat in the quiet and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that she kept meaning to fix, and breathed in and breathed out, and picked up her phone. She scrolled past Dean. She scrolled past Patrice. Her thumb stopped on Luke's name, and she pressed call before she had decided to. It rang twice. Hazel. Not surprised, not alarmed, just present. I'm sorry to call late, she said. Her voice was wrecked, and she didn't try to hide it. Don't be. A brief pause, the sound of movement. What do you need?" She almost said nothing. "I'm fine. I don't know why I called." She could feel the words forming, the old reflexive deflection. "I don't know," she said instead, which was the truest thing she'd said in weeks. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," he said. He came through the kitchen garden gate and found her on the porch steps, and he sat down beside her without preamble or performance, close enough that she was aware of the solidity of him, the simple physical fact of another person who was not going anywhere. They sat for a while without talking. The orchard was silver and still under a 3/4 moon. The cicadas had quieted. The hill country night pressed soft and enormous against the edges of the porch light, and somewhere out past the cedar fence line, something moved in the dark and then was still. She told him what had happened. Not all at once, and not in any particular order, but he listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without redirecting, without reaching for a solution before she was finished. She said she felt like she was failing her mother. She said she felt like she was failing her business. She said she was so tired that she couldn't tell anymore where the tired ended and she began. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I pray with you?" She nodded. He prayed the way she imagined he did everything, without performance, without flourish, in the plain and direct language of a man talking to someone he knew well. He thanked God for Hazel and for Eleanor. He asked for rest that was deeper than sleep, for clarity that was better than a plan, for the kind of strength that comes from outside a person rather than from the bottom of what they've already used up. He said Eleanor's name like she mattered to him specifically. He said, "We know you carry what we can't without any self-consciousness about the we." When he was done, Hazel didn't say anything for a moment. "We know you carry what we can't." She thought about Isaiah 46, the verse she'd written in her margin 2 weeks ago. Even into old age, even then, the God who made them would carry them. She had believed it in her head. Sitting on the porch steps at midnight with the hill country around her and Luke's prayer still in the air, she felt it move somewhere lower than her head. They sat until midnight. He walked back through the garden gate, and she watched him cross the fence line and disappear into the orchard, and then she went inside and upstairs and checked on her mother. Sleeping, peaceful, the photograph on the nightstand, the hill country night outside the window. And then she went to her own room and opened her Bible to the 4th chapter of 1 Peter. The passage spoke of gifts, of how each person has been given something, some particular grace, and that we are to use those gifts in service to one another. Good stewards of God's grace in its many different forms, not hoarding it, not carrying it alone, receiving it from others and offering it back, and letting the whole thing move the way it was designed to move, through people and between them, the way water moves through good land. She thought of Connie's hand patting hers at the peach stand. "You know my number. Don't make me wait too much longer." She thought of Jess refilling her water glass without comment. She thought of Luke saying, "We," as though her burden had become, in some small way, also his. She had spent so long being the one who poured out. She had never learned to be the one who held her cup open. She picked up her phone and looked at Connie's number for a long time. She didn't call tonight, but she didn't put the phone away either. Chapter 8. Good Stewards. She called the church office on Monday morning and asked if Pastor Garrett had any time this week. The church secretary, a cheerful woman named Beverly, who had been answering that phone for 22 years, and treated every call with equal warmth, whether it was about the flower rhoda or a crisis of faith, said she'd check. She came back on the line in under a minute and said Pastor Garrett had Tuesday at 10 and that Nora had mentioned something about a coffee cake. if that was any incentive. Hazel said she'd be there. The Howells lived in a small stone house behind the church, the parsonage technically, though Nora had transformed it into something more than that word implied. There were roses trained up the front fence, and a porch with 2 good chairs and a wind chime that rang in the cedar-scented breeze as Hazel came up the walk. The door opened before she could knock. Nora Howell was a compact woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who had settled into her own kind of peace, with knowing things about people before they'd said them out loud. She was not a soft woman, exactly. She was warm the way good bread is warm, which is to say, structurally sound and deeply comforting and made with intention. She took one look at Hazel and said, "Come in, honey. Coffee's hot." There was coffee cake on the kitchen table, which Hazel had expected, and also a small vase of fresh-cut roses from the front fence, which she hadn't, and which, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, made her eyes sting briefly before she got them under control. Pastor Garrett appeared from his study with a book under his arm and his reading glasses still on, which meant he'd been in the middle of something and had come anyway, which was the kind of man he was. He shook Hazel's hand and said he was glad she'd called, and then they sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Nora poured the coffee, and nobody rushed anything. Hazel had prepared, in the way she prepared for most things, a reasonably organized account of the situation. Her mother's diagnosis, the siblings, the business, the rehearsal dinner. She delivered it clearly and without excessive emotion, and felt, as she came to the end of it, that she had been fairly thorough. Pastor Garrett nodded slowly. "And how are you, Hazel?" She opened her mouth. "Not the situation," he said gently. "You." She closed her mouth. She looked at the coffee cake. She said, "I don't know how to do this." "Tell me what this is." She almost said all of it, which was what she'd told Luke, and which was true, but felt too broad to be useful. She sat with it for a moment and tried to be more specific. "I don't know how to love her well, and also—" She stopped. Started again. "I've been telling myself that keeping her close, keeping everything running, holding it all together myself, that's what loving her looks like, and I'm starting to think I've had it wrong. But if I've had it wrong, then I don't know what right looks like, and that's—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "That's frightening." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind chime moved in the cedar breeze. "It is frightening," Pastor Garrett said. "You're not wrong about that part." Nora set down her coffee cup. "Hazel." Her voice was direct and not unkind, and went straight to the point the way Nora always went straight to the point, which was one of the things Hazel valued about her, and also, at this moment, found slightly terrifying. "You have been pouring yourself out for as long as I have known you. For this inn, for your guests, for your church family, for your mother. You take care of everything and everyone inside your reach." She paused. "And I have never once, in all the years I've known you, seen you let anybody take care of you." Hazel didn't say anything. "That's not strength, honey," Nora said. "That's armor." The word hit with the precision of something that had been true for a long time and simply waited for someone to name it. Hazel looked at her hands around her coffee cup. She thought about the laundry room floor. She thought about scrolling past her brother's name and her sister's name. She thought about a verse she had read in 1 Peter, each person given a gift, each person called to offer it and receive it, the grace of God moving through people, and between them the way it was designed to. "I read something the other night," she said, "in 1 Peter, about gifts, about being good stewards of grace." She looked up. "I've been thinking about stewardship as something I do for other people. I don't think I've ever thought about it the other way around." Pastor Garrett smiled. small and certain, the smile of a man who has just watched something open. "That's exactly it," he said. "The body of Christ isn't meant to function with one member carrying everything and the others watching. It's meant to move together, each part giving, each part receiving." He leaned forward slightly. "Refusing help isn't humility, Hazel. It's isolation dressed up to look like independence." She felt that one settle in somewhere real. He reached for his Bible. He had brought it from his study, she realized, along with the book, which meant he had been thinking about what to say before she arrived, and turned to Paul's letter to the Romans, the 12th chapter. He read it in the way he read everything, without performance, just the words doing their work. "Scripture tells us," he said, "not to be shaped by the patterns of the world around us, the world that holds up self-sufficiency as a virtue and treats needing others as something close to failure, but to be transformed, renewed in our thinking, seeing ourselves and each other differently from the inside out, not the world's way, a better way." "The world says, carry it yourself," Garrett said. "Carry it quietly, carry it competently. Don't let anyone see you strain." He closed the Bible. "The kingdom says something entirely different. It says, come, bring what you have and what you don't have, and what you've been pretending you don't need, and let the people around you be the grace of God with skin on." He looked at her steadily. "There are people in your life who want to help carry this. Let them." Hazel thought of Connie's hand patting hers at the peach stand. The flat, firm certainty of it. "Don't make me wait too much longer, honey." She thought of Luke on her porch steps at midnight, praying we like it was the most natural word in the world. She thought of Jess, who had been quietly holding things together for weeks and refilling her water glass and watching her with patient, worried eyes and not once pushing, but also not going anywhere. She had been so determined to be the one who gave. She had confused giving with worth and receiving with weakness, and called the whole arrangement strength for so long that she had almost believed it. A renewed mind. A different way of seeing. She looked at Nora and Garrett across the kitchen table, at the roses in the small vase, at the coffee cake that was both practical sustenance and an act of love, and she felt the tightness in her throat ease, not fixed, not resolved, but cracked open in the right direction, the way soil cracks open in the spring when something underneath is finally ready to grow. "I need to make a phone call," she said. Nora smiled. "You can use the porch if you want the privacy." She used the porch. Connie picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," Connie said without preamble. "I need help," Hazel said. The words felt strange in her mouth. Angular, unfamiliar, like a door she hadn't opened in so long, the hinges were stiff. "With my mother, I can't do it the way I've been doing it. Jess is wonderful, but she's not a nurse, and I need someone who—" "I've been waiting for you to ask me for 3 weeks," Connie said. Hazel laughed despite herself, short and wet and completely genuine. "Connie." 3 weeks, Hazel. I had it on my calendar." A pause that Hazel could hear was warm. "Now, tell me what Eleanor needs, and we'll figure out the rest." She stood on Nora Howell's porch with the roses on the fence below her and the wind chime turning in the breeze and the hill country sky going on forever overhead, and she told Connie what her mother needed. She told her all of it. She let someone else hold the shape of it for once, and the relief of it was so profound and so real that she had to sit down in one of the good porch chairs before she was finished. She had been carrying this alone for so long. She had not understood, until this moment, how heavy it actually was. Chapter 9. The Harvest Table. The peaches went into everything. Hazel had planned it that way. had called Luke 2 weeks out and asked if she could use his fruit for the summer harvest dinner, and he had said yes before she finished the question. So there were peaches in the salad, sliced thin over arugula with shaved fennel and a white balsamic glaze. Peaches in the centerpieces, nestled among stems of lavender and sprigs of fresh rosemary in low cedar bowls. Peach preserves in small clay pots at every place setting to take home. And a peach and brown sugar, galette for dessert, free-form and rustic and smelling when it came out of the oven, like the very best version of a hill country summer. Luke had delivered the fruit himself on Thursday morning, 3 full crates of the large freestones at peak ripeness, and had stood in the kitchen long enough to watch Hazel slice into the first one and confirm that yes, this was the harvest he'd hoped for. She'd handed him a slice over the kitchen counter, and he'd eaten it standing there and said simply, "That'll do," in the tone of a man who was deeply pleased and saw no need to elaborate. She had thought about that moment more than once in the days since. The evening of the harvest dinner arrived in full cooperation with itself, warm but not punishing, a soft breeze moving steadily off the hills, the kind of late June night that the hill country occasionally produced, as if to remind you why you stayed through the brutal part of summer. The meadow was still blooming, the bluebonnets long gone now, but replaced by the tall gold of black-eyed Susans and the feathery white of inland sea oats along the fence line, and the string lights over the harvest table came on at 7:15 and turned the whole scene into something that looked, as one of the guests said upon arriving, like a painting someone made from a memory of the best night of their life. 60 people filled the long table and the smaller round set in the meadow's edge, and the noise of them, warm and various and full of laughter, rose up into the hill country dark like something good being offered back. Luke was there. He had come at 5 to help move the last of the cedar rounds into place, and had stayed because Hazel hadn't told him not to, which both of them understood as the invitation it was. He worked the edges of the evening, carrying, replenishing, helping Jess manage the flow from the barn kitchen, with the easy competence of a man who had spent a career making himself useful in complicated situations and had never needed credit for it. Connie had brought Eleanor down at 7, after helping her dress in the blue linen blouse she'd worn to the neurologist's appointment back in May, her white hair pinned with the small pearl clip she saved for occasions. Eleanor had looked at herself in the mirror and said, "Well, that'll do," which made Hazel smile for a reason she kept to herself. Eleanor was luminous. There was no other word for it. These windows came without warning and without schedule. The disease gave them up unpredictably, briefly, like light through a shutter that opens and closes on its own. And tonight, the shutter was open wide. Eleanor moved through the gathering with warmth and wit and the easy social grace of a woman who had spent 60 years making rooms feel more hospitable simply by walking into them. She remembered names. She asked good questions. She told the story about Enchanted Rock and Hazel's father to a couple from San Antonio who listened with their chins in their hands like children hearing something they knew was true. At some point in the middle of the evening, someone put music on. Something old and unhurried, a waltz or near enough. And Pastor Garrett, who was there with Nora and had been talking to Eleanor for the better part of an hour, stood up and offered his hand with the formal courtesy of a man who had been raised to know when a dance was called for. Eleanor took it without hesitation. They danced at the edge of the meadow, among the black-eyed Susans, in the glow of the string lights. The pastor and the grandmother, small and deliberate, moving to something that the hill country night seemed to hold still for. Nora stood nearby with her hand over her heart and laughed the way you laugh when something is almost too good to be true. Several of the guests turned to watch without knowing quite why, only that it was the kind of moment that asks to be witnessed. Hazel stood at the edge of the pergola and watched her mother dance. She felt it move through her, not as grief exactly, though grief was part of it, and not as joy exactly, though joy was most of it. Something that held both. The understanding that she could not keep every moment, that this one was not hers to hold forever, that the fact of its passing did not diminish what it was. Here, now in the light, her mother's face turned up toward Garrett's with a smile that had been her mother's face since before Hazel was born. "My times are in your hands." She breathed it in, she let it be enough. By 10 o'clock, the guests had gone, trailing down the gravel drive with their little pots of peach preserves and the satisfied quiet of people who have been well fed and well received. Jess had walked Connie and Eleanor inside an hour earlier. Eleanor worn pleasantly thin by the evening, leaning gently on Connie's arm by the time they reached the back door, still smiling. The meadow was quiet. The string lights swayed in a small, warm wind. The hill country night had deepened to that blue-black that made the stars look close enough to be intentional. Hazel began clearing the harvest table. She had done this 100 times. The end of evening work, the folding and stacking and carrying, the return of the table to its plain self after a night of being something more. There was something she had always liked about it, the honest ordinariness of it, the way the work of an evening moved in both directions, and the clearing was as much a part of it as the setting. She didn't hear Luke come back out. She just looked up, and he was there, gathering the cedar centerpiece bowls at the far end of the table, moving in that easy way of his. And it seemed for a moment like the most natural thing in the world that he should be there, at this table, at this hour, in this light. They worked their way toward each other from opposite ends. The only sounds were the cicadas and the soft clatter of the work, and somewhere in the cedar breaks, a nightbird calling once, and then going quiet. When they reached the middle of the table, he stopped. She stopped. He looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her, steady and direct, without any of the hedging or deflection she'd gotten so skilled at herself, and said, "Can I say something?" "Yes," she said. He set down the bowl he was holding. He was not a man who fidgeted or circled, and he didn't now. "I've been thinking about you," he said. "About us, I suppose. About the fact that for 3 years I've been your neighbor and your friend, and I've been glad to be both." A pause. Not uncertain, just honest. "But I'd like to be more present in your life than a fence line allows. I'm not asking you to know what that means yet. I'm not in any rush." His voice was quiet and certain in equal measure. "I'm just asking you not to close the door." The string lights swayed above them. The meadow was dark and fragrant around them. The hill country night did what it always did. Went on, vast and patient and entirely indifferent. And inside that indifference was a small lit space where 2 people were standing at a cedar table, and something true was being said. Hazel looked at him. At the quiet certainty of him, at the man who had shown up at a fence line with borrowed tools and easy conversation and had never once pushed, never once demanded, had simply been, consistently, quietly, reliably, there, who had sat on her porch steps at midnight and prayed we like he meant it, who had looked back once from the end of the orchard row and then let her be. She thought of armor. She thought of doors. She thought of a renewed mind and a different way of seeing. "I'm not closing it," she said. His expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but something warm and settled, like a question that had been waiting a long time for a simple answer. He nodded once. He picked up the cedar bowl. They finished clearing the harvest table together, side by side in the last of the string lights, and when it was done, they stood for a moment in the quiet meadow and looked up at the Milky Way, cutting its pale and ancient path across the hill country sky, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying tonight. It was enough. It was more than enough. Chapter 10. Even into old age. She called Dean first. It was Sunday morning, early, before the house was awake. Hazel at the kitchen table with her coffee, and the back door open to the garden, the hill country dawn coming in soft and pink through the live oaks. She had been thinking about the call for 2 days. She had written a few things down on a notepad, and then put the notepad away, because she didn't need notes for a conversation with her brother. She needed honesty, and those were different things. Dean picked up on the third ring, sounding like a man who had been awake for a while and was not surprised to hear from her. Hazel. "I owe you an apology," she said. A beat of silence. "You don't—" "Let me say it." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I've been treating this like my decision to make alone, and I've been treating your research and your phone calls like interference instead of what they actually are, which is you trying to take care of our mother the best way. You know how." She paused. "I'm sorry for that." Dean was quiet for a moment, in the way he got quiet when something had caught him off guard, and he was deciding how to receive it. "I haven't exactly made it easy," he said finally, which from Dean was considerable. "No," she agreed, "but I haven't made it possible. There's a difference." She looked out at the garden, at the early light moving through the tomato stakes. "I want to do this together. Actually, together. I'm ready for that conversation now." She heard him exhale, long and slow, something releasing. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay, Hazel." She called Patrice after. That call was shorter and louder and ended with Patrice crying in the good way and saying she loved Hazel and Hazel saying it back and meaning every syllable because she did. She had never stopped, even when the kitchen table felt like a negotiating room, and her sister's careful, "Would you consider it?" had lodged behind her ribs like a splinter. Love and frustration were not opposites either. She was learning that the hard way and the true way. The three of them had a video call that afternoon, all in their respective kitchens, which felt right, the ordinary Sunday afternoon domesticity of it. Dean had done more research, because Dean always did more research, but this time he led with a question instead of a bullet point. "What matters most to you, Hazel?" "About where she is and how she's cared for," she told him. She said she wanted their mother to be able to see land. She wanted her to be within reach, not 45 minutes away on the far end of a highway, but close enough that Hazel could come on a Tuesday afternoon just because it was Tuesday. She wanted familiar faces. She wanted a place that felt, as much as any place could, like somewhere Eleanor Morrow had chosen, rather than somewhere she'd been taken. Patrice said she'd been looking too, quietly since the kitchen table conversation, not wanting to say so until she had something worth saying. She had found something. It was called the Hill Country Gardens Memory Care Residence. It was on the eastern edge of Fredericksburg, 10 minutes from Sycamore Hill, tucked into a property with old live oaks and a working kitchen garden and a wide porch that looked out over a stretch of open limestone hill. Small, 18 residents, family-owned. The director was a woman named Ruth Ann Schaefer, whose grandmother had been a resident there 20 years ago, which was why she'd bought it and why she ran it the way she did. The review said things like, "They knew my mother's name from the first day," and she said it felt like a home, not a facility. Hazel read the website 3 times after the call ended. She called Ruth Ann Schaefer on Monday morning. They visited on a Wednesday, Hazel and Eleanor, just the two of them, because Hazel wanted her mother to feel the place without the weight of the whole family watching for her reaction. Ruth Ann met them at the door herself, a capable woman in her 50s with the easy warmth of someone entirely comfortable in her own building. She showed them the common rooms, the garden, the individual rooms with their good windows. She talked about the daily rhythms, the meals made from scratch, the music programs, the care philosophy. And she talked about it directly to Eleanor, not around her, which Hazel noticed and filed away in the place where she kept the things that mattered. Eleanor was quiet through most of the tour. She asked 2 questions, one about the garden and one about whether they allowed people to bring their own things, their own photographs and quilts and particular objects. And Ruth Ann answered both with the care of someone who had heard those questions before and understood why they were being asked. At the end of the tour, Ruth Ann left them alone in the garden for a few minutes. It was a good garden. Raised beds of herbs and vegetables, a climbing rose on the far fence, 2 large live oaks throwing dappled shade across a stone path. Several residents were already outside, moving at their own pace, tended carefully and without fuss, by staff members who seemed to have mastered the art of being present without being intrusive. Eleanor stood in the garden and was quiet for a long moment. She turned her face up toward the light coming through the live oak canopy, that filtered, golden hill country light, and breathed in slowly. "It smells like something," she said. "I can't say what exactly, but something good." "It does," Hazel agreed. Eleanor reached out and took her daughter's hand, and they stood there together under the live oaks, while a mockingbird worked through its repertoire in the branches overhead, unhurried and entirely pleased with itself. "I know what you're thinking," Eleanor said. Hazel looked at her. "What am I thinking, Mama?" Eleanor considered. "You're thinking you don't want to let me go." She said it without accusation or sorrow, just plainly, the way she said true things. "And you're also thinking that loving me well and letting me go might be the same thing." She squeezed Hazel's hand once. "You were always the one who thought the hardest thoughts." Hazel's throat tightened. She did not trust her voice immediately, so she waited. "I haven't decided anything yet," she said when she could. "Today was just a visit." Eleanor nodded serenely. "Of course," she said, "but it's a good garden." The plan they made together, the 3 siblings with Ruth Ann's guidance and Connie's practical counsel and one long, honest conversation that went until 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, was not a plan for immediately. Eleanor would stay at Sycamore Hill through the summer, with Connie coming 4 days a week and a part-time helper on the weekends. Ruth Ann would hold a room. When the time came, not if, but when, and they said the word plainly now, all 3 of them, because saying it was better than circling it, Eleanor would move to Hill Country Gardens. She would bring her quilt and her photograph and her pearl earrings. Ruth Ann's garden would be there. It was not a perfect plan. There was no grief-proof version of this plan available. But it was a real one, made by people who loved the same woman, and had finally, imperfectly, belatedly, with considerable coffee consumed, found a way to love her together. Hazel slept through the night for the first time in 6 weeks. On a Thursday morning in late June, she brought her Bible out to the porch before Eleanor woke. She turned to Isaiah 46, the passage she had found on the night of the diagnosis, sitting alone on this same porch with the hill country dark around her and the weight of it all new and enormous. She had read it then as a promise she wanted to believe. She read it now as a promise she had watched be kept. God's words to his people, ancient and unhurried and unchanged, spoke of his commitment to carry them through everything, even into old age, even when their hair was gray. He who had made them would bear them, would carry them, would sustain them, not in spite of the hard years, but through them and past them and out the other side. She read it aloud, quietly, into the morning. Behind her, the screen door opened, and Eleanor came out in her robe, her hair loose, her feet in her good slippers. She settled into the other porch chair with the ease of a woman who knew this porch well, who had drunk 100 cups of coffee here in the past weeks, and intended to drink 100 more before summer was over. "Read it again," Eleanor said. Hazel read it again. Eleanor listened with her eyes on the meadow, on the black-eyed Susans moving in the early breeze, on the cedar fence line and the peach orchard just beyond it going gold in the first of the morning light. When Hazel finished, Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Your father loved that one," she said. Maybe she was fully here, and the memory was clear and real and hers. Maybe she was somewhere else, and the words had simply landed on something true that lived below the reach of the disease. Maybe it didn't matter which. Hazel thought it probably didn't matter which. "It's a good one," Hazel agreed. She saw Luke at the fence line an hour later. He was walking the near row of the orchard, checking the fruit the way he did most mornings, and he looked up when he heard her come through the garden gate and change direction without any discussion. He was carrying a basket. The peaches in it were the deep gold pink of fruit that had arrived exactly where it was going. No trace of green, no uncertainty, just the thing itself at the fullness of what it had been growing toward. Actually ripe. She walked to meet him at the fence, through the black-eyed Susans and the tall meadow grass still wet with the morning. The hill country was luminous around them, the limestone hills going gold and cream in the early light, the live oaks full and dark green, the sky above them that particular blue that exists only in this place and only in the early morning before the heat of the day has its way with it. The kind of morning that made you believe the land had been made with intention. Which Hazel had always believed it had. He held the basket out across the fence. She took it. Their hands touched. Neither of them stepped back. He looked at her, slow and certain, and said, "You look different." "I feel different," she said. He smiled. Not quickly, slowly, the way the best things happen in the hill country, without rushing, without apology, arriving in their own time and their own fullness, the way a peach ripens, the way a season turns. The way a heart, given enough grace and enough time and enough people willing to stand at the fence line and refuse to leave, eventually finds its way back to open. "I'm glad," he said. The meadow moved around them in the warm morning air, gold and alive, and the hill country held them both in its ancient, patient, completely indifferent, and somehow deeply personal way. And above the peach orchard and the wildflower meadow and the old cedar fence line that had been the beginning of everything, the sky went on and on and on. Thank you for spending some time with us, listening, reflecting, and resting in God's endless love. If this story touched you, encouraged you, or brought a moment of peace, I'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like. It helps our uplifting stories reach more hearts. If you'd like to join us for more grace-filled tales, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until we meet again in the next story, may you carry His grace with you, one gentle step at a time. Simply Grace Audio. Simple stories, endless grace.